Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for coming to my talk today. Today, I'm going to be discussing innovation and how we took all of the experience and lessons learned as a team to create Ludia's new original mobile game, Lovelink, which launched worldwide on mobile platforms in September. I'll be sharing the history, the challenges of the entire production from the perspective of turning key learnings into opportunities for innovation. So Ludia is one of Canada's leading mobile video game companies. We were founded in 2007 in Montreal, and we have 400 team members and are proud to work hand in hand with awesome partners who trust us and support our creativity. Our portfolio includes original games based on internationally recognized brands such as Dragons, Titan Uprising, Dungeons and Dragons, Jurassic World and Jurassic World Alive, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Dragon's Rise of Berk, and much more. Lovelink is actually the first fully original IP released by the studio and one that I'm super excited to share today. My name is Gemma. I'm the producer for Lovelink. Just a little bit about me. I've been at Ludia for a bit over 2 years and previously worked at several other studios in Montreal and the US. I come from a background primarily managing production in large-scale MMOs and sandbox survival games on PC. And apologies, here's something in my ear. As well as some R&D and prototyping projects. My genre is primarily action horror, so definitely a far cry from romance simulation. And though definitely a shift for me content-wise, Lovelink has been an extremely rewarding development experience, especially when it comes to the freedom we had to innovate. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk about the history of the project today. So what is Lovelink? Well, if you're familiar with any of today's real dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, or Hinge, you're on the right track. Lovelink is an interactive dating simulation story game populated with a large array of colorful, interesting characters for you to swipe on and match with. Player will create their profile and then get swiping left on a character that you're not super into and swiping right on the ones that you like, hoping to make a match and get chatting. Just like in the real life apps, except I guarantee everyone's a lot nicer on Lovelink. So just for example, you could maybe meet a dog sledder who's racing across Alaska, help an inmate on death row prove his innocence, or fall in love with an artist who's cursed with lycanthropy, all the while making different choices that influence the narrative and, of course, unlock some spicy pictures every now and then. So all of these things that the player does in the game contributes to your overall relationship level with the character that grows and builds over time. Eventually, you unlock more content and collectibles and can even go on special dates. Characters even react contextually to the player's actions, making them feel a little bit more believable and real. Players can chat with multiple characters at the same time with their own, and each character has their own narrative that unfolds in real time. That means your crush, if he needs to head out to work, then he means it. He's going to be back in about 8 hours to pick up the conversation where you left off and send you this immersive messenger-style notification on your phone to let you know that he's back. Some players have actually told us that their partners got a bit jealous because they thought they were on a real dating app getting real messages from people. So on our side, that's mission accomplished. So right now in the game, we have over 80 fun, diverse characters, and over 50 of them are actually matchable. The game launched worldwide in September, like I said, and after undergoing the majority of its production in this work-from-home context to really exciting and encouraging results. Lovelink's super unique in its approach to the interactive narrative mobile genre, completely eschewing the typical presentation and conventions for this dating app presentation. Developing a game that drastically diverges from the genre standard was definitely a calculated risk, but the idea and the faith in that idea didn't come from nowhere. It was built over time through the lessons that we learned on our previous project, and that's the journey that I really want to talk about. So innovation comes in a lot of different forms, often with adversity being the catalyst. I tend to run my teams on an agile methodology, And we always try to treat problems or obstacles that arise simply as a spotlight on an issue that we can now find a long-term solution to and ultimately improve the project. We try to embrace change and be adaptable, and build team excitement around doing something new and different. This is especially true when we were in pre-production for Lovelink, because we were faced with a large number of challenges ahead and wanting to address those potential problems at their source rather than living with band-aid solutions or legacy decisions that were coming from previous projects. And what I found is that when you foster a solution-oriented team culture who aren't afraid of change, then you're much more open to taking risks and innovating. So before I talk about Lovelink, the app, and how we came to those various decisions that we made, we have to go back to the project that came before, a project that the majority of the team and myself were working on before moving to Lovelink, and where we really first started to foster this team culture. So originally launched in January 2018, What's Your Story is an interactive narrative game featuring fully animated interactive episodes where the player can create, customize, and play with their own avatar through over 20 stories. The unique selling point of What's Your Story that set it apart from other similar games, such as episode choices or chapters, was that it was primarily composed of licensed content. So we had brands like Charmed, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Ghostbusters, 90210, Archie, Scream, just to name a few. The game itself was fairly typical for the genre in terms of its presentation, with the player selecting a story from a poster in a Netflix-style main menu. The player goes on to create an avatar and begins playing through the story one episode at a time, with each episode being fully animated and choreographed and assembled in our in-house story creation tools. Player can then make choices that impact the narrative and branch the story and unlock various story options and clothing customization. The demographic for this kind of game is primarily women, and we observed a 70-30 split in favor of women in practice. The genres of the stories were fairly diverse. We had drama, horror, comedy, and action all present in the catalog. But usually each one has a romantic core. The general structure of these stories was to include a love interest character along the way, and more often than not, there would be some kind of dramatic love triangle. Paid choices in the game usually revolved around a balance of significant plot moments, such as in Scream, whether or not you save a character from being murdered, and then scenes with your crush. It's very much in line with the standards within the genre. So now that we know a bit more about the genre, the demographic and the content, I can kind of talk more about the challenges that we faced. So for context, I joined the team in early fall 2018, and about 8 months after the worldwide launch. I was very new to the genre, admittedly, coming from a background primarily in MMOs. However, it was super apparent to me from the start that content production was a hugely limiting factor for a game of this kind. All monetization happens within the stories, so you need to provide those stories for players to engage with the app. It was very hard in many games to meet the content consumption rates of players. So it's super important to make that process as efficient as possible. So optimizing that pipeline was my first priority. Working with licenses definitely has its advantages because it gives us access to those recognizable and beloved characters, big brands, fun stories with ensemble casts, and lots of room to move within those universes. The downside is that there's often a long turnaround time for approval, especially for art assets when you have likenesses and things like that that have to go through agents and have approval processes. So despite these stories being very high quality, the delays between the content dropping to players we found was just too long. So we started looking for options to fill the gaps in our release calendar with new content. So fortunately, before I arrived, the team had already started exploring this, with our writers starting on the first of the original stories of the project in the summer. This made the What's Your Story app unique within the Ludia ecosystem of games, which were at the time entirely based on licenses. And this was kind of our first stepping stone to what would eventually become Lovelink. Adding original content for me was a no-brainer. But the real question was that we needed to answer was, what sort of originals should we write? Because after all, it was basically new territory for us in a lot of ways. Licenses kind of come with their own universe and set of rules to follow. However, with originals, we basically had free reign to create whatever we wanted. And, you know, of course, in typical producer fashion, I was helping the team to optimize and streamline the pipeline for creating these stories in order to reduce the turnaround time lost to reviews and setting up like budgets and robust guidelines for what an original should look like. So we played a lot of our competition and we read a lot of stories and took a lot of notes about the trends and tropes and then just our general gut reactions to each piece of content that we consumed. And we checked all of that against what we had seen already working within our app. So things that we noticed are like the staples of the genre, let's say often things like pregnancy drama stories, Twilight-esque love triangles, and most ubiquitous 50 Shades of Grey inspired stories. 50 Shades stories are basically their own subgenre in this type of game. And as an aside, I know sometimes the posters can look a little funny, but these sorts of games are all about like wish fulfillment, thrills, drama, romance, all the sorts of things that maybe you don't get in real life. And I think it's super important to take a non-judgmental approach when we're discussing it. Since most of these stories were pretty heteronormative, it led to the decision at the time to cut male avatars from the stories, which I'll discuss the impact of later. All of these story types we didn't directly offer in the app at the time. While our content was unique, interesting, and we had all of those cool licenses, we were kind of missing a potentially simple opportunity to provide some more genre-typical content, so low-hanging fruit, as it were. So with that in mind, the first original story I greenlit with the team was Who's Your Daddy? Sorry, not sorry, I fully take credit for that title. It was a cute pregnancy romantic story with a love triangle. It was something that we hadn't really tried before, and it had a very simple, small cast that we were able to put together in the tool quite quickly with assets that we had. And as far as firsts go in the app, it was also the only story where you can choose to be in a poly relationship at the very end. This story ended up becoming one of our top performers. And the second story that we, of course, wanted to tackle was our sexy billionaire story, right? So for context on this one, I'd had a hunch within the game for a while that the tone came off as a little bit too irreverent. And like I said, you want to take this sort of genre seriously and, you know, engage with it on a sincere level. And for a sexy wish fulfillment kind of story like this, you need to be considerate of the player, never mock them for enjoying a guilty pleasure, and it's always got to be about embracing the fantasy. It's a very subjective thing that's hard to quantify, but we were all pretty on board and made the commitment to changing the tone in this story. So we also took it one step further by stripping out the majority of the animation, leaving just simple idle animations, much akin to a traditional PC dating sim, where you'll have an NPC on one side and player on the other, and they exchange dialogue with a narrator kind of describing the action that's going on. It was in part to reduce production cost further, but it was also to more match that serious tone that we wanted to go for, because the exaggerated and cartoony animations that we had at the time would not complement that very well. What we ended up with was pretty drastically different to the presentation of the other stories, perhaps jarringly so to older users. And within the team, we did have a bit of concern about how it would be received. But it was relatively low risk and potentially high reward, so we went ahead and gave it a shot. And on release and consistently since, that story has been our top performer, behind only our largest license in the game, and it only has 5 episodes. So it was a big success all around. So from there, we continued accelerating our content production as we ended 2018 and entered 2019, onboarding some outsourcers, which was a resource that we had not taken advantage of, to help even the load of our writers, and continued focusing on more optimizations within the app, the gameplay features, and continue growing the game. That was our focus. So we were doing everything we could, and we had built some really great momentum and trust within the team, and I was happy with the positive changes that I was seeing in the dynamic and in the pipelines. Unfortunately, we were still not where we wanted to be in terms of game performance. And at the start of 2019, in agreement with our editorial team, we began to take what we had learned so far about the genre and through the game, and used it to pitch some new game changer ideas, something drastically different from the current DNA of the game. Now, we had a lot of different ideas. Some were more out there than others, but they were all based on what we had seen working and the general behaviors of that demographic. So we had things like a fashion-esque wardrobe collection metagame, a choose-your-own-adventure reality show. But the one that's really stuck was Mixer, a simulated dating app where each character represents a story in the same way a poster on the What's Your Story main page did. It was a complete departure from anything on the market at the time. And it was an aesthetic that we'd often seen utilized by story games in their advertising and marketing materials. So to me, that indicates there's a clear demand for that kind of game or that kind of content. So we decided, hey, let's be the ones to deliver. So one of the things that we noticed in What's Your Story is that players didn't know what story to choose. We had all this great content, but I guess have you ever browsed Netflix and been completely overwhelmed by choices, and you just end up browsing for half an hour or watching something that you've already watched before, or even worse, just turned it off entirely? All of this content you've got at your fingertips, and it becomes almost paralyzing. Compare that to the simple, intuitive feel of browsing profiles on Tinder or Bumble. Suddenly you're just actively making choices without even realizing it, just by the act of browsing. It's a concept that we really wanted to build the prototype around. So it's always a good sign in a brainstorm meeting when you have an idea and everyone in the room is there to contribute something or get excited about it. Even though we hadn't locked anything down and it was just a discussion, that energy is always very exciting, especially in that concepting phase. And it really just flowed out from there. So, and chat apps are not necessarily anything new, with apps like Hooked on the App Store, taking a more like voyeuristic chat story where the player is reading other people's conversations. And then, of course, we have more traditional dating sims, my favorite being Dream Daddy on PC, or games like Mystic Messenger they combine the two, but it is ultimately one long linear story that you talk to characters in a specific succession. We were going to do something that was an innovation on all of that, where the player has the freedom to chat with whomever they want at any time without relying on any overarching narrative. So from that base concept, we knew that we had to completely restructure the stories and be all about meeting cool characters, getting to know them, and experience their personal stories. All the fun and quirkiness of What's Your Story, but with a more personal touch and more intimate moments, talking one-on-one to a character. More adult, sincere, and totally indulging the fantasy. Basically what we learned worked extremely well in Billionaire. It was also almost entirely text-based, lacking the typically animated episodes of What's Your Story, so it was a massive departure from what we had been doing. But again, Billionaire had raised our confidence levels with that, as we'd seen that a story can perform super well without needing all of that choreography, as long as the story's engaging. So we focused the art team instead on creating this great, unique character art instead, because those characters were the heart and soul of the story, and ultimately the entrance into the funnel of that story. So we were super inspired by apps like Bumble and Tinder, Bumble especially, because it has these different SKUs, including dating, Bumble friends, and networking. So it's an app that you can use to connect with people for multiple reasons. And we really like that. So you meet cool people, go on adventures, maybe go on a date with some of them. They say that dating apps are gamifying the dating experience. So we thought we would romanticize the gaming experience. So we moved quickly into a prototype phase, built entirely within the existing What's Your Story game. From a design perspective, we had only the bare essential features, focusing mostly on the swiping and matching section and the accompanying logic that was required, as well as the chat itself, which was the primary delivery method for the stories. We used the story creation tools that we had, and we modified them as we needed, and we kept that development as focused as possible. The story structure was simple and linear, only including simple non-paid choices, mainly because we knew that paid options would more than likely work based on what we knew from What's Your Story, and we didn't want to spend that precious dev time proving something we knew. Instead, we actually created a story with no choices at all, just to see how that would impact the engagement of the story too. We instead focused that time on testing what we didn't know for sure would work, primarily the time gate pacing between episodes. So when a character says they're going to go to work, they go to work for 8 hours and come back, because that was something that we had never done before. And of course, as you can see on the slide, collecting some sexy pictures that characters may occasionally send you. And spoiler alert, yes, they work pretty well. From a content perspective, we had pretty dramatic changes. The writers could no longer rely on the visuals and animation that we had in What's Your Story to tell the story. The perspective and the tone of the stories changed dramatically and were much more personal and character focused. We stuck to the same general structure and length of our episodes, but we were able to move a lot faster without the need to have director's notes or review episode choreography anymore. So ultimately, it was a net gain in terms of production time and accessibility for outsourcers. From an artistic perspective, this change in needs with regard to the visual assets allowed us to explore an overhaul of the art style to kind of close the gap between us and our competitors and really firmly plant us in a 17+ audience, whereas before we had been 13+. Again, another very subjective view that's hard to quantify, but my feeling and the feeling of others on the team was that the global art style for What's Your Story felt a little bit too childlike, or maybe just too cartoony, and often people's perception of that can be that it's for kids. And we wanted to move away from that. And that definitely would not have worked with, the sort of pictures that the characters are going to send you in a chat. So you can see the original kind of art exploration here on the left, and we eventually refined that down to the crisp cel-shaded style you can see there on the right, driven kind of by a balance of visual aesthetic, time to produce, and ultimately the ability to unify that style across multiple artists. It really gave us the room to focus exclusively on the biggest impact art assets for players instead of small, props and things like that we required in What's Your Story. The biggest challenge we faced for making that initial batch of content for the prototype was selecting what that content should be. We had time to write approximately 5 stories for the prototype, and we knew from What's Your Story data that players generally romanced male love interests and the players were female. But that was simply because most of our most popular stories only offered that option. If you remember, it was something that we had cut in order to move faster. Ultimately, we opted for an 80-20% split on the profiles that would have a story attached. So we had 4 playable male characters and 1 female. We were still in a position based on metrics of the game to assume the player was a woman, as I said. So the content was written in a way that kind of assumed that. And that was what we chose to go with at the time. All the stories were original. And we were able to kick off pretty quickly using the lessons learned with What's Your Story in terms of the episode and season structure. And to fill out the rest of the carousel, because a swiping section isn't going to be much fun with just 5 characters, we filled it out with non-playable profiles, and we really took the time to add some more female presenting characters, splitting the total of characters available about 65-35. We also took time to add characters of different ethnicities and gender presentation with the time that we had. You can kind of see here our original lineup of characters. So the prototype went live, and we were able to immediately see the conversion rates of each character. The way it was set up to work allowed us to see the swipe rates on characters, both left and right, and on all characters, including the non-playable ones. We could, from there, see trends and create leaderboards, ensuring that we always targeted our top performing characters for new stories. We could test profiles in advance and make sure that they were on target with our characters. And I can tell you that when we launched, we did have a big betting pool on who would be number 1. And we were actually surprised by a lot of the results. Some of our internal favorites weren't popular at all. And other characters seemed to have an X factor to them that was a bit unexpected. The whole swiping section was a really great way for us to actually check our biases as a team and make sure that we were giving the players what they wanted before we invested in creating a new story. Additionally, Eve, who was our female character that we launched with a story, was very popular, as were all the female characters, actually. And it totally shone a light on our process for creating and designing those stories and characters. We learned an important lesson about not making sweeping assumptions on character archetypes and what players want. In order to get accurate data, you need to provide the content to be tested to generate that data. We used these user insights to design and release our next couple of stories, including an indie filmmaker, a goth werewolf, and a supermodel horror story. We also added several more characters to the NPC roster just to see how it would impact the rankings. All of this took place over the course of 12 months. And towards the end of it, we were all in agreement that Lovelink, as it was now called, would do best as its own app. We had faith in these initial results that we saw, and we had the support of the rest of the studio, so we entered a short pre-production stage for the new app. This was the time to take all the major lessons that we had learned working within the constraints of the What's Your Story platform and apply them in a new context through R&D and design. So our primary goal was to recreate the nice, super slick interface, the feel that you get from real dating app experiences. We were really leaning into the fantasy and changing the way we thought about adding gamified elements. Many of our designs were informed by our experience on What's Your Story and other games, but then it was applied through the lens of how do we fit that in a real dating app. It was a pillar that we built the experience around. As per the prototype, another goal in design was to maximize player access to the content. As we demonstrated, to keep them engaged and reading the stories, the swiping section was really great because it's so intuitive and exciting to swipe and find new characters. We did a lot of work on removing friction in the swiping section of the game, emulating the look and feel, and building the logic of how matching and swiping actually works and reacts to player input. Accessibility to the content was absolutely crucial, and we never wanted a situation where a player would open the app and then not take an action. Even if it's just a swipe, that's all it takes. We had observed that in What's Your Story, where they would open and have that kind of decision paralysis that I talked about earlier. So I forgot to remove some animation here, apparently. Earlier, I talked about how we cut male avatars from What's Your Story as kind of a pragmatic decision. And, while it was successful and letting us move a little bit faster, it ultimately came at the cost of alienating some users, as well as compromising our values as a team. It raised the question when designing the user experience of Lovelink, what should a player's profile look like? We discussed the value of splitting players by gender or orientation within our dating app. It's an expected convention in a real dating app, right? However, we had this opportunity here to build a system that would allow us to have a more flexible and agnostic way of approaching it, and ultimately give the player more agency. We knew that it wouldn't be a nice experience in a fantasy wish fulfillment dating app to have a chunk of characters that are potentially off limits to you just because we arbitrarily assigned them a preference. Players should always be the center of attention, no matter the character that they choose to match with. One of the things that I always remember from my favorite RPGs, for example, with romance options, is applying mods that remove restrictions on those romance options. So why not just not put them in there in the first place? In the end, besides a superficial level of immersion, the downsides and potential restrictions on production and content weren't worth putting those in place. It was directly at odds with our goal of providing accessibility to a bunch of cool characters and stories. And of course, from a purely pragmatic design perspective, it's super inefficient to spend time and care creating these really fun stories only for them to be potentially seen by a small portion of players because they checked a certain box or made a certain selection at profile creation. This is a fundamental design decision that means that players are much more likely to meet characters that they might have otherwise overlooked, and in some ways removes expectations on the types of stories or interactions that you'll have in the first place. In that way, we're able to fulfill a core value of the game, but ultimately benefit the project as well, ensuring that all our content can be accessed by all players. And this decision informed a lot of the decisions that came after. It's one that's very critical to the DNA of the game. So going off that, the secret to Lovelink is it's more complex than it appears. The player is presented with a stack of different character profiles within the swiping section, and they can swipe left if they're not interested and swipe right if they want to match with that character. We never wanted a situation where we spent a ton of time making a super cool, fun story only to have players not engaged because of a poorly converted cover image, for example. We know we've seen it before in What's Your Story, and we know that people do judge books by their covers. And the challenge is that by design, a dating app is all about browsing quickly and making those snap decisions. Players can make up their mind on a profile super fast, and if they don't like it, boom, 20 episodes of content that they'll never see. So the way we decided to address this was that a story can have multiple characters linked to it. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you'll see really weird thumbnails on Netflix, or if you've checked the same shows in another country on Netflix, they'll be completely different? It's actually because Netflix are continually running complex A/B tests, and many different thumbnails are used. They're always optimizing and improving their click-to-watch conversion rate on their platform. We actually used to do something similar, obviously on a much smaller scale, within What's Your Story, testing different posters with users by splitting them into 2 or 3 different groups and measuring which posters converted best. Usually what would happen after that is that the poor performer would be scrapped and the top performer would be made the default within the app. However, with Lovelink, we had the opportunity to make those underperforming characters still valuable, so no work would be wasted. So when a player matches with one of these profiles, the secondary profile becomes unmatchable and the story proceeds with the selected match. For example, you can see on my screen that we have Adam and Dominic, and they are both linked to the photographer story. So I'm swiping through and I'm not super into Adam, so I swipe left. Later on, I have Dominic in my swiping section and I swipe right and trigger a match. Both of those profiles, like I said, are linked to the photographer story. So what happens is when I match with Dominic, Adam will become unmatchable by default the next time I see him in my swiping section. That way, the story will then proceed with Dominic as normal, swapping in his name and all of his assets and art. And so for me, the player, I get my preference in match, and players that like Adam get their preference in match. The app continues to feel populated and alive with characters, and we keep the funnel entrance to that story as wide as possible, really maximizing the opportunities for players to find and engage with it. So you can see here some examples of what I mean when we swap out the assets. This system is completely scalable, with most of our stories right now having 2 to 3 characters linked to them. The system also completely supports having stories with male, female, or non-binary characters linked to the same story, and we have a way to swap in pronouns and names correctly. All we have to ensure on our side is to make sure that the selfies and the collectibles are match the character, basically. It's something we can add progressively to the game without an issue, and it's a great option for making sure our top performer characters always have a matching story. We can also monitor if our characters aren't performing as well, then we can add an additional one to that story so we ensure that that story still gets seen by as many players as possible. The intention in the future is that characters are ultimately linked with multiple stories on a scale of priority, meaning that players would never miss content and always get their first choice of character to match with. Maybe later I have a change of heart on Adam, for example, but I've already matched with Dominic. So when I swipe right on Adam the next time I see him, he's actually linked to the sexy chef story instead, and it proceeds as usual. The linking system means that every player gets a customized experience and is able to match with the characters that they most prefer and will ideally convert them to being paying players. So you can see here we have some of our alt profiles, but all of these characters are they share a story, but they are the variations of characters associated with it. We've actually seen our community really, really engage with this system to the point where they demand to know who the alt characters for upcoming stories are going to be so they can make sure they pick the hottest one when the story is released. It always opens up discussions for who are their favorites, and it's honestly like a super fun little meta that I never expected to see players so invested in. The flexible system also provides us with avenues to constantly add to our diverse range of characters. We get to keep testing what players will find interesting, and we can keep a balance of like those tried and true archetypes, and then still keep adding in more experimental characters with little to no overhead. Even if a character underperforms, it doesn't matter because some players will like them, and for them, that's their number one match that they love. Every profile that we add improves the game and adds to the experience of a populated living app. So in terms of innovation within our pipeline, it's one I'm super proud of. I love some low risk, high reward content. And of course, speaking of content, we knew that players would need regular, ideally multiple times a week, content drops. The What's Your Story tools and pipeline would not cut it. We needed to make our tools more accessible, streamlined, and perhaps most importantly, outsourcer friendly. We knew the limits of the content that we could produce effectively in-house based on our experience in What's Your Story. So outsourcing compatibility was basically mandatory in order for us to be able to scale in the future and to meet those demands. Some of those tools also extend to quality assurance, knowing that as the volume of content increases and expands, so does the strain on QA. So we also planned to introduce forms of automated testing as they would be required to make sure that the quality remained high. And lastly, from the tech perspective, within Ludia, Lovelink is also somewhat of an innovation in that it's the first game launched on the newly developed backend. We worked in parallel with our core tech team with a shared goal of not only testing and deploying this new tech, but also de-risking any future projects in the pipeline who would be sharing that technology. It was actually a huge part of how we pitched the game, offering to take on several of those challenges directly and pave the way more smoothly for other teams. I'm not going to go super in-depth on the technology itself because I'll run over time, but the architecture of the project, the content delivery system, and all of our other tech that we utilize were all innovations that were championed and pushed forward by the team in order to achieve our vision of the product. It was a huge learning experience, and we definitely faced and overcame many challenges as part of that. It really is a testament to our team culture of finding solutions and not fearing change. So Lovelink is the first game released by Ludia that's comprised entirely of original content, like I said at the start. And it's definitely given us a lot of space to grow and experiment. We have the confidence and data to show us that players would enjoy and engage with our originals from What's Your Story, and we built our pipeline to support producing it as efficiently as possible with great quality. We knew that while it was important to make sure to cater to genre tropes and player expectations, we should always strive to be continually throwing new stuff at the wall to see what sticks. So we opted for a shotgun approach to our content for our launch, testing a number of different genres, each with different levels of heightened reality within them, and all of them having that romantic core. Each one is completely unique. The main thing to note is that when we write a story, we only write one version of the story, and that one version of the story is shared across all the profiles that link to it. This makes the production time for stories very efficient, and it maximizes their potential to be enjoyed by the majority of our players. We built a system of syntax to swap out the pronouns and names and art assets, like I said, to make sure that it aligns with the character that the player's matched with. We also use the data from the first rounds of stories in Mixer to optimize and restructure them, taking note of the types of things that players seem to enjoy about the stories and the stuff where we missed the mark. From there, we were able to create a best practices guide, and one that we're constantly adding to as we learn more. With those guidelines, in addition to the innovations that we made within our tools, we were able to essentially triple our content production rates, in addition to making the content production completely scalable, which was a massive improvement. We also have in place a continual feedback loop of improvement. We monitor all of our new stories, and we're always innovating within new stories and putting that back into our review process. We're never locked into a hard template. So we definitely learned during the prototyping phase as we entered production for Lovelink to never assume that we knew what players liked and never take data necessarily on face value. For example, in the prototype, we could see the swipe rate success of each character, but we only had a pretty small palette of characters, about 22. If you have a character of a particular archetype who underperforms compared to your other characters, that doesn't necessarily mean that players aren't interested in that archetype, and that could be a very surface level and potentially dangerous reading. More likely, what it means is that you simply didn't provide the player enough choice within that archetype. One character isn't a choice, but if you give players a choice of 10 characters within that archetype, one of them's always going to be the bottom performer, let's face it. But some of those 10 might be your top performers globally in the app. You'll never know if you don't keep experimenting and always offering new things to the players to react to and engage with. It's important to us that all of our stories are inclusive and non-judgmental, and we engage with player needs for wish fulfillment and sincerity. It's something that people are crying out for, and it's what we want to deliver in the app. We've ditched that irreverent "what's your story" tone, and we just come at it with full sincerity and fun. And much of the humor and quirkiness is definitely still there. I can confirm that the brainstorming new characters and stories on this project are the most fun meetings I've ever had in my career. And as a callback to the stories I talked about earlier in What's Your Story, we do in fact have a sexy billionaire in Lovelink, except now everyone's welcome in his playroom. So we've talked about all the lessons we learned in design, in content, in tech, but most importantly, I wanted to talk about the team. As I said earlier, innovation comes in a lot of forms and often as a result of adversity. In order to face and overcome adversity, it's crucial to have a strong team at your back and a unified vision to move forward. We built a culture of treating every mistake, hurdle, and challenge as a problem to solve. We don't point fingers or assign blame. And we learned to avoid emotional decision-making, leaning much more on quantifying our decisions and assumptions as much as possible. It took a lot of time and constant self-evaluating to get there. we're all open to improving. And as that trust grew, we were more aligned and we were ready to take on new challenges. Having that strong alignment that we built over the course of What's Your Story and that prototyping phase definitely prepared us for Lovelink. It's what carried us through a difficult year. That's been 2020, as I'm sure you all know. Lovelink was predominantly produced and released during our ongoing work from home situation, something that we all had to quickly adapt to and find solutions to work effectively. We might all be pretty far apart, but I can tell you that the Ludia general chats get spammed with Lovelink emotes and memes on the regular. We can't be stopped. Since launching, we've seen a huge amount of positive feedback from players with high engagement and exciting results all around. Players have praised the fresh take on the genre and are super attached to the characters and have sent us messages thanking us for the inclusive nature of the app itself. The fan community is super engaged and positive, and they're always sharing memes, fan art, and fan stories, even just in the short period of time that we've been live. It's super inspiring and rewarding for us to see. And we are now, of course, hurriedly working to add tons more content to the game, and we have a really exciting 2021 planned for it. Lovelink's a super interesting project to me in a lot of ways. And while writing this presentation, it was kind of neat to trace the app back from where it is now to where we were in 2018. When I first arrived at Ludia, I'm ready for my first foray into mobile gaming. By using those early lessons that we learned to shape Lovelink from the inside and out, from design to the tools we created and to the fundamental way that we approach our content and create our characters, it was a super fun learning and a really great learning experience. Even if the game hadn't been a success commercially, I would still consider it the most rewarding project of my career. Perhaps most exciting to me now is that we've started down this path and we've built this team culture to a point where it's just part of how we operate. We've built this platform up, so now we can continue to remain creative, keep experimenting, and keep looking for ways to innovate and improve. And it's definitely not over yet, that's for sure. So anyway, that's Lovelink. A super unique game, unlike anything else currently on the market, in a genre innovation directly born from our many lessons learned. The game has been a wonderful project to work on, and for me, a great example of what can be achieved when a team is given the tools and space to explore a concept. I'm really happy and humbled to have the trust of Ludia, who not only supported us to be able to develop a game like this, but also offered me the opportunity to speak on its behalf today. Thank you very much for listening and attending, and be sure to check out the game on iOS or Android. And of course, if you'd like to learn more, you can find me in all the usual places on LinkedIn, or you can reach out via the Ludia website.